Good evening. My name is Andre Conchado, and I work for UNEP. And it was with great pleasure and honor that I present to you our speaker for today. His name is Stephen Frost. He's a globally recognized diversity, inclusion, and leadership expert. And he founded Frost Included in 2012. Stephen works with clients to embed inclusive leadership in their decision-making, and has worked in-house at KPMG as head of diversity and inclusion from 2014 to 2015. Before that, between 2007 and 2012, Stephen designed, led, and implemented the inclusion programs for the London Olympic and Paralympic Games as head of diversity and inclusion for the London Organizing Committee. Stephen also teaches inclusive leadership at Harvard Business School, Singapore Management University, and Sciences Po Paris, my alma mater, and that is where I had the honor of meeting him the first time. Stephen also serves as an advisor to the British government and KPMG's Diversity and Inclusion Program. He was a Hertford College Scholar at Oxford University and a Fulbright Scholar at Harvard. And he was elected the recipient of the 2010 Peter Robertson Award for Equality and Diversity Champions, and was named the 2011 Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum, and recently voted one of the top 100 influential LGBT people in the UK. And so without further ado, I would like to pass the mic on to Stephen Frost.
Andre, thank you very much. It's very kind of you. Let me get this up here. Andre, thank you very much. It's great to be with you and your colleagues. This is a really important initiative that you're doing, so I'm delighted to support. In conversations with people and preparing for today, we thought about what was going to be most useful to you and most topical in your mentoring program. And diversity inclusion is clearly something that you're all valuing highly. The results that I just saw a moment ago, that 95% of you totally value diversity, is really heartening to see. We'll test that in the next hour or so, but let's just say that it's a great start. So I want to just acknowledge at the beginning that this is a heck of a year, right? 2020 is a year that's going to be historic. And when we look back on this year, it will really be a defining year in our careers and our lives, actually. And so wherever you are right now, how it is, I hope that you're safe, I hope that you're well, and I'm really, really glad that you're joining us for this session. I wanted to really just acknowledge what's going on right now, that essentially we're living through a dual pandemic, right? We have the medical pandemic, which is going to be historic, not only in terms of the medical ramifications, the tragedies, but also the political, geopolitical consequences of that. But we're also living through a pandemic of racism and a heightened awareness of diversity and inclusion as it affects our corporations, our communities, our relationships, our lives. And I want to acknowledge that right now it's a really, really tough time for many people. However, in one sense, we have been here before. In the midst of crisis, it actually forces us to confront things that in normal times we can ignore. And as Andre said at the beginning, I was involved in the London Olympics and Paralympics. And shortly after starting on this was the terrorist attacks in London. We also had incredible political, economic, social pressures on us as a committee, and a finite budget, an immovable deadline, and incredible complicated stakeholder relationships. But that really forced environment actually made us make bigger, bolder, braver decisions, and I think producing more inclusive games as a result. Now, today, really, what I want to talk to you about is leadership. The urgency of inclusion requires inclusive leadership, requires all of us to respond in terms of our own leadership style. And as you already know, leadership is about what you do. It's not about what you say, but about what you do, and particularly your behaviors. So in particular, inclusive leadership is around valuing, seeking out, and leveraging our differences. Now, 95% of us apparently do that already, which is great, but it's about creating psychological safety. Are you actually safe to disagree with your boss without fear of retribution? Do you generally have an open mind in the way that you approach decisions? Do you actively listen? And are you transparent in the decisions that you make? Now, to be clear, this is not involving everyone in everything. Not everyone could do the jobs you're doing. This is not about charity. And it's not including difference for the sake of it. That would be tokenism. But what it is deeply, profoundly acknowledging that no matter how brilliant you think you are, you're not brilliant enough. And that we are only as good as we know our need of other people. Let me give you some really important examples. Do you know driverless cars? Those cars now that are being developed without drivers that are automatic. Did you know that in a 2016 study by Georgia Tech, it found that these cars are bumping into black people more than white people? Because the camera-based AI technology has not been designed with race in mind. And actually it's harder at detecting darker skin tones. This is a bad outcome on every measure. Did you know that, for example, in terms of car safety, all things being equal, in a head-on car crash, women are far more likely to die than men because we've designed them using male crash test dummies as the norm. We're not thinking about inclusion in design. And of course, right now, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, we are still doing multiple clinical trials all around the world using volunteers who are disproportionately middle class, white, able-bodied, and they are not reflective of the people who are disproportionately dying from COVID. So we need to diversify the clinical trials to have more equitable and effective drugs being developed. You see, inclusion isn't just a nice thing to do to be a nice person. It is, but it's also a critical component of good decision-making and design thinking. And it's this profound level, this next level of taking it seriously, the seriousness with which it deserves, that I want you to think about this evening. You see, we are living in a time of forced innovation. The old rules don't apply anymore. If you think about the bottom left of this quadrant, when we had old technology and existing markets of supply and demand, we had incremental innovation, perhaps a new version of a tech software update or a new version of a phone. But we're in a situation now where the market's changing incredibly fast, technology is changing incredibly fast, and we're in a situation of radical innovation. And if I'm to be honest and blunt with you, most people who again think they're brilliant are not brilliant enough because we cannot compute what's actually happening. We can't actually understand the market changes and the technology changes that are happening in real time as it affects our own decision making. So what do? Well, first of all, I want to put it in the context of some of the challenges that we're facing right now. What we're facing is system one thinking. Any of you who've read Kahneman will know thinking fast, the amygdala at the back of the brain, where we have gut reactions to things, we tick things off lists, and we don't engage our more thoughtful neofrontal cortex, deeper thinking systems. We have gut reactions to things. We have biases that are being endemic. We're fearful of difference. And so actually, we're hunkering down. We're relying on affinity bias, who we know, and we're relying on confirmation bias, what we know. So we're sticking to what we know and who we know, when exactly right now, to deal with the context of forced innovation, we need to be doing exactly the opposite. There's a lack of trust. There's a hyper-individualism and a fear that actually is a really, really prescient force that we need to deal with right now. But of course, there's hope. There's actually the chance in the midst of this change and chaos to think very consciously, deliberately, if we use our neofrontal cortex and slow down to consider things in a different way. An opportunity for greater consciousness, an opportunity to smash the hierarchy and the divisions of old, and actually seize this year as a way of creating greater community and new connections, to actually form personalization. I was brought up with the rule of the golden rule: treat others as you wish to be treated. But in 2020, we need to move to the platinum rule: treat others as they wish to be treated. We need to adapt to others, not simply to be nice and inclusive, but to urgently cover our own blind spots and calibrate our own thinking. So there's 5 things I want to run through with you that I think are going to be very useful in terms of addressing this urgency of inclusion. And it starts with empathy. Empathy, again, is something which often we discount in our quantitative, scientific, supposedly rational mode of discourse. But empathy is critical to understanding the other, to adapting to them, rather than expecting them to adapt to us. Decision-making. I've mentioned this already, but it's critical. At the moment, you might be feeling stressed, full up, high cognitive load. And it's not surprising, because actually doing your job in 2020 is infinitely harder than doing it even 5 years ago. And the main reason is that the amount of information that we have to process to make good decisions is doubling every 2 years. There's an exponential increase in information, but there isn't an exponential increase in our cognitive capacity to process that information. So there's an increasing gap between what we're expected to do and what we're able to do. And people work harder, they expect to be paid more money, get another assistant, but actually it's an impossible situation. And one of the things that surround us that is free, in infinite supply, and completely within our own capacity is to include difference, to include people who are as different from us as we can possibly handle, who will be able to see those blind spots, calibrate the thinking, and help us deal with this challenge. I want to do an exercise with you on this third point around participation. The way this has been set up, this mentoring program, it seems very inclusive. The way it's been introduced, the way it's been curated. But I want to challenge all of you with an experiment. I'd like you to grab that pen and paper right now, or your iPad or whatever device you're using. And I'm going to ask you 4 questions. And I want you to answer them honestly, because only you will see the answers unless you choose to share. The first question is, I'd like you to write down the name of your 5 best friends in the world. Just write down the name of your 5 best friends in the world. And the second thing I'd like you to do is to write down the name of 2 people who live on your street or in your apartment block, 2 neighbours. And the third thing I'd like you to do is to write down the name of your partner, your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, other, your partner, if you have one or if you want one, or if it's not going very well, the name of somebody you'd like to have. And then finally, I'd like you to write down the name of your 5 closest colleagues in your organisation, whether you're UNEP, the OECD, whatever your organisation is, please write down the name of your 5 closest colleagues. These are people that you trust, people that you turn to for advice, people that you will be able to be honest with privately. So hopefully right now you have your 5 best friends in the world, your partner or partners, a couple of neighbours, and your 5 closest colleagues. And if you draw a line around those names, you draw a circle around those names, we can call that your in-group. And your in-group is really important for 2 reasons. One, in terms of yourself, it's your security network. It's the people who give you love and security and make us human. But professionally, it's our source of information, our benchmark, our reference point. And of course, depending how diverse that group is, will depend whether we're actually having our decisions challenged properly. Now, personally, you might find that your group is very like you. Even if it appears diverse, politically, sense of humour, other alcohol preference, it might actually be quite similar. And that's okay, because we need love and comfort and security in our personal lives. But professionally, if that's too similar, a process we call homophily, then it could be problematic in terms of our decision-making and our true ability to include. So when 95% of us said that we really value inclusion and diversity, I really hope that's true. But this is one test of whether we really do have diversity and inclusion at the core of our decision-making and our thinking. People who aren't in that group can be considered to be in your out group. And that's something that I'm going to ask you about later on. Fourthly, I think in this world, we need to think about our self-awareness. At the moment, you can probably see a checkerboard, a chessboard, with a shadow from a green cylinder and 2 squares, A and B. If I just put this here, you can probably see actually that whilst you thought those squares were different colours, they're actually the same colour. You see, it's just one of those things that actually shows that we're biased. We think that our eyes see, but they don't. It's our mind that sees, either system 1 or system 2. thinking fast or thinking slow, what we think is different is actually similar. So self-awareness is critical for us to think about. You might know about bias tests already. You can go online and Google Harvard IAT, or there's various tests that you can do to check your level of bias. But another exercise I like to do with students, whether they're MBA students or MPA students, is to get them to have an arm wrestle. And I get them to pair up with the person next to them in class, often sitting in their in-groups, and I ask people to have an arm wrestle. And the goal is to score as many points as you possibly can in 1 minute. And the result tends to be the same in Singapore, in Paris, in New York, in London. About 80% of the class, predominantly men, score 0 points, maybe 1, maybe 2 points. And they've been competitive and they're laughing and sweating and joking. About 20% of the class, usually predominantly women, have scored 30 or 40 points because they've collaborated. The goal here was to score as many points as possible, not to kill your opponent. And actually, the way that we think about collaboration versus competition is critically important to whether we're actually able to act on our intentions to be an inclusive leader. The final point I'd make is about focus. We live in a world of many distractions, and that cognitive load is high and getting higher. How do we actually, in the midst of all these challenges, zone down on what's really important? And that relies on focus. If we do not consciously include, we will unconsciously exclude. So we have to think very deeply about this in the key decisions that we make. Now, of course, in any day, and today you might have had a long day, and maybe you're tired, and you want to have some food and some wine, and your blood sugar levels are low. You might be stressed and full up, reflecting on everything you've heard so far. So you can't focus on every single decision that you're making during the day. Otherwise, you'd have a nervous breakdown. But if you don't focus on the important ones, then you'll never truly include. So we're at this really important moment where we could go either way. In the midst of everything that's going on in 2020, we could actually see an increased exclusion, an increased polarization. And actually, we could see people start to put food further away, whether that's digital divide, social divide, in-groups, out-groups, bias. And we're seeing it all around us in politics, in society, in the economy, in medicine. Or with leadership, with inclusive leadership, we could actually have a convergence, a reawakening, a reaffirmation, a real focus on the need to include, not simply to be nice people and to be full human beings, but actually because it's in our own enlightened self-interest to do so. That when you win, I win, we win. So really in that, I want to kind of set up a few questions for the breakout before I hand back to Andre. Reflecting on the exercise you've just done, what is your in-group really like? Are you really in the 95%? Or do you have work to do? Who's missing? Thinking about your customers, your clients, your stakeholders, the people who aren't as privileged as you. Who's missing? And what's your out-group look like? And then finally, thinking about that arm wrestle, whether you're killing your opponent or collaborating for mutual victory. Do you compete or collaborate? And what's your style? It's important for us to be conscious. And as Einstein said, the important thing is not to stop questioning. You opened this session with a very inspiring quote from Socrates, which was to build the new. Well, actually, this is decision time. It's a decision whether we're going to kind of increase exclusion or build inclusion. And I really, really hope that you, in this work, in your conversations to come, do choose inclusion. It's decision time, but I feel confident that with thought and good rectitude, you will choose inclusion. So I'm going to pause there, say many thanks for having me along, and hand back to Andre.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Stephen. That